Hi folks, we're going to do something a little bit different on the channel this week. So I was recently asked by Kendra Harding, a recent graduate of the Masters in Composition program at my school and current fellow in their Office of Career Development and Community Relations, to do a 20 to 30 minute presentation because I'm one of these weird people who isn't freaked out by public speaking. Since the overall theme of the talks given at this event was the wilderness, I decided to talk a little bit about the history of narrative structures in music, and specifically how they relate to the composition of my first symphony, subtitled The Grand Tetons, after my experiences in that national park several years ago. Time was somewhat limited given A, the scope of the presentation, B, my unexpected podiumlessness and thus notelessness, and C, the fact that the talk was mostly given to school administration officials and not musicians, all of which meant that I had to boil things down and simplify things here and there where I could. Either way, I filmed the whole thing because I felt like it would be a nice little change up for the channel, and because several of you out there have been asking for videos that dive into more of my compositional styles and practices. Plus, it moves the channel away from just being a new composer biography every week. It's nice to keep things a little bit fresh every now and then. So without further ado, here is my presentation on musical narrative. Oh, and there were more people there than it looks, I promise. Historically, music has been conceived of in different ways. As, back in the Middle Ages, you had composers thinking of music as a kind of expression of numerological values, music of the spheres and things like that. A perfect sort of evocation of the mathematical beauty of the world. But as you go throughout music history, you begin to see music more conceived as that of the composer trying to tell some kind of story, regardless of what that story is or how particularly grounded in reality that story might be. You have composers writing things about fate in the universe, but you also have composers who are trying to write things about their lives. It's a strange art form because it's not necessarily the first thing you think of when you're thinking about telling a story. I mean, you can think about, there are images or collections of images that tell stories, or there are books that tell stories. In fact, it's very hard to think of a book or any sort of text that doesn't tell some kind of story. I mean, even the most infamously impenetrable of texts, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, it's hundreds of pages of one multilingual pun, and yet people still think of it as, this is a story. We need to read it as a story, even though it's very hard to kind of get into what that story even is. All right, so musicologists often see pieces as if they are narratives, because we have an implied need for narratives as human beings. We want to see things as someone telling us a story. In fact, anthropologists and other scientists often say that our need for these story structures is what really defines us as human beings more than anything else. But even then, you have pieces such as Tchaikovsky's Sixth and Final Symphony, the Pathétique Symphony. People often see this as this, heart-wrenching suicide note because he died under mysterious and very sudden circumstances not long after its premiere. But there's no real evidence to support that it was some kind of musical suicide note. We know what these composers were like. We know of their histories. And yet, we still want to apply those histories to the pieces themselves. It's not a narrative. He's not saying, oh, I'm going to kill myself in a few days. It just happened to work out that way. Likewise, if you have a great composer of song cycles, Schubert, perhaps the most famous of all of these, he does not tell the story of Winterreise. That's Wilhelm Müller, I believe. He's simply one of the people in the middle. He's translating and he's transforming this existing narrative. Likewise, you have pieces where, they're such large-scale structures that you want to hear them as the composer trying to tell you something, because you want to have some way of understanding this massive canvas on which the piece rests. Liszt's Piano Sonata in B minor, his only work entitled the Piano Sonata, is this massive thing. How do you come to understand a work such as this without trying to think of it as some kind of story? Or likewise, any of Mahler's symphonies. You have performances. Bernstein makes them last almost 2 hours sometimes. How do you understand that if it's purely abstract? Now, in the case of Mahler symphonies, there is some kind of programmatic aspect behind them. But simply having a programmatic aspect does not make a piece necessarily a narrative structure. Having a narrative or telling a story is a certain kind of subset of an existing programmatic narrative. It's about something, but narratives are about telling a particular story as opposed to absolute music. On the other hand, you also have absolute music, such as in the case of Brahms, where people still think of it as some kind of narrative of his love for Clara Schumann. So composers cannot get away from actually having the music interpreted as narrative structures. Partially, this is because there are examples of narrative pieces. Probably the most famous, one of the first I could think of in history, was Hector Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique, which is all about his, well, going crazy about taking opium and thinking he's going to hell. And it's a great piece, but it's pretty messed up. It's kind of a wacky dude. Likewise, later on in the Romantic era, you have Benedict Smetana's first string quartet, subtitled From My Life. And the final movement of this actually contains a very high string harmonic, which emulates a sound that he heard. He developed tinnitus because he had syphilis. As a related note, if you don't know what a Romantic composer died of, 50-50 chance it's syphilis. I'm just putting that out there. I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you. Likewise, I think there's another example here. Oh yeah, tone poems. Tone poems were not invented by Richard Strauss, they were invented by Franz Liszt, but Strauss took them to a whole nother level. And Strauss not only saw the tone poem, as Liszt did, as the rightful successor to the symphony, but as a fusion of music and poetry. In the same vein that Richard Wagner was writing these operas, which contained sort of everything, the Gesamtkunstwerk. Strauss was also writing in a similar vein in that he was trying to emulate literature specifically through music. So that's probably the closest example we have to an actual consistently applied narrative structure from music history. But of course that died out because he's considered one of the last Romantics, and after that you have Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School completely eliminating that. So moving on a little bit of a different direction, as a composer, this is very difficult to deal with because, living and working in the 21st century, you have hundreds of years of this great tradition, all these great composers who have come before you. How do you fit in with that? And likewise, I have a major interest in musicology, so that should be even greater on someone such as myself. So the first challenge is in dealing with this past. How do you actually create gripping music that's your own? The second is, relatedly, if a form in music is simply the overall structure of a piece, how do you make an interesting form out of this past? We have examples of binary forms and ternary forms and sonata forms and variants and rondo forms and all these sorts of things. But in modern composition, formal elements don't need to be nearly as broad. These are like long sections that are repeated. But I'm more interested in seeing how small these elements can become, how malleable they can become, and how structural or substructural they can be before they're really completely eliminated from creating a cohesiveness within the musical rhetoric itself. And finally, you have to find a distinct voice. Now, I don't think that a composer should go out and say, I want to create my voice because this is what I do, this is my artistic ethos, especially not as a student. It's something that you happen to come across. And for me, I think one of the major things that I've been drawn to throughout my most effective pieces is using some kind of narrative structure, specifically a narrative that's based around the emotions of lived experiences. So I'm not necessarily setting poetry about, the Grand Tetons. If I'm writing a symphony about the Grand Tetons, I'm telling the story of how I felt on June 1st, 2013, which is when I took a road trip there. All right, yeah. So that's it. So the four movements of this symphony are based around these experiences. In fact, my parents and I are known for going on these really long cross-country road trips. In the past several years, I've been in 49 states, 9 Canadian provinces, and the Yukon Territory, all by road. And it's been interesting because you break down in some really wacky places. So the first movement is the only movement that's received a premiere to date. This was performed last spring by the UNCSA Symphony Orchestra as part of their annual composers concert. And this is probably the most distinctly narrative of all of the movements, because the story of going over Teton Pass is one that really is, frankly, quite terrifying whenever I remember it. Because we had our car, which we later realized was sort of on the brink of total meltdown, going up this terrifying mountain road. And then when you get to the top, this is the view. So you can see, and here's Jackson Hole, and Jackson's somewhere in here, it's too pixelated. But you see the Teton Range beyond. So you're going up and over this pass, and between these two mountain ranges lies a little town. And of course, you're at the top and you're really taking in all this beauty, but then you realize, oh, we gotta go down. And in a car that doesn't really have that much in the way of brakes, not really something that I was interested in doing, but we did it anyway. And so, but that's the story of the whole thing. And so I thought, this is a great structure. This is a great thing to base a piece off of. You have to find a way to emulate the emotions of whatever this is. So how I did this is actually compositionally quite tight. There we go. So there's 4 main ideas. The engine chord is a little bit special, and I'll get to really what makes it special in a minute. It looks like this. This is in the cellos and the basses. It's very, very low. And I remember Dr. Rothkopf was like, that's really going to be muddy. I'm like, yeah, it's an engine. It's struggling. But the weight of struggle is also conveyed because these are double stops on the lowest strings of the cellos and the basses. Like they're struggling themselves to get this sound out, which in turn gives you the impression that something is struggling. And the remaining 3, if we can get those up here real quick, these all mean different things. I think there's one more.
Sorry.
There we go. That's all right. These mean different things, but they're not as tied down to the narrative. So how I use this is actually much different than how I use any of these. I tended to think of this as, well, this is more of a theme that evokes sort of the brash, bold, granite faces of the mountains. Whereas this is a little more introspective. That's a little more elusive because of the sudden harmonic change towards the end. And then this is something that's used a little more as something reflective at the top of the mountain. Something that's more beautiful and more relaxed than other things. And the way I use these, you can see these are...
Sorry, finger slipped.
Oh, wow. That's a spoiler alert. That'll make sense in a second. Anyway, so you can see all these are really short. I mean, this is just one repeated chord. That's not even a full measure, really. It's just this sound. These are all, used sort of as the impetus for different themes. So they're very rarely heard straight through. I mean, this actually provides the basis for a big brass chorale near the end, but it's not heard as this melody. Each of these notes is transformed into a chord, and then those chords are inverted. And this actually doesn't come in its full form until really the second movement, when it's transformed into a hymn. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, part of the struggle of creating music that uses this kind of emotions of lived experiences, this kind of inspiration, is that you're really trying to create a film score in a certain way. It's not really a film score for a memory because, well, the journey over the pass actually lasted a lot longer than the 10 minutes duration that the piece actually is. But you do have to deal with questions of proportion. And the biggest difference between Michelangelo and Picasso is a sense of proportion. I mean, you can say, well, one's one medium, one's another, one has color, one is... The biggest difference here, they're both looking this way, is a sense of proportion. This is very sort of, has that ancient sort of classic look, and this is, looks like, this poor lady looks like she's been in a blender, to be perfectly honest with you. But you see this idea of proportion lasting throughout all these different kinds of art forms. So the question is, how do you deal with this? And it is much like scoring a film in that sense, because you you're not tied down to cues and hits and writing around dialogue and, going back to the director or the editor or them making decisions for you. You really are free to write based on the proportions that you want to hear, which is a real open-ended kind of thing. But a good film cue, which is really the last vestige of this late Romanticism, these tone poets, you sort of have the wallpaper school of film composition, these Hans Zimmer types. But your John Williamses, your Danny Elfmans, your Michael Giacchinos are all writing in this late Romantic idiom. And they're all, however, subservient to the proportions of the visual medium. Unconstrained from the visual medium, it's the composer's own intuition who's, we're trying to figure out exactly how these proportions should work, which goes back to questions of form. Yeah. Again, you have examples in Gustav Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde. This sixth movement is entitled Farewell, and it lasts about as long as the rest of the movement, the rest of the piece combined. So it skews your perception. So these proportions and perceptions is really two sides of the same coin. Let's get through it. Yeah. So how you deal with these different things is a real question. Which let's move on a little bit because I kind of remember this already. Yeah. You don't want to see that. Not when we don't have breaks. Yeah. So the way I conceive of these is there are implicit and explicit narrative devices. So an explicit narrative device is that which evokes something that you're already familiar with. It evokes a sound that you know. If there's a siren that comes in, that means something. If you hear, this pounding noise, if you hear an engine noise, that means something to you. If you hear something that's a hymn or a folk tune that you know, that means something to you. And those can be used to try to create the canvas on which the entire piece rests. Yeah, they're integral to the narrative in that the explicit device in movements of going over Teton Pass is this engine chord, which is big and weighty and struggling. Without that, I might say the piece is about the Grand Tetons. I might even say that the piece is about Teton Pass, but I wouldn't be able to say that the piece is about a journey over that pass, because without that as a sound that grips you and draws you in, it means nothing. And implicit devices are all the other ones that you saw. These are things that are a little more malleable, that utilize things that you're not necessarily already familiar with. I think there are 3 here as well. Yeah, so they're more subject to my control. So I'm not tied down to, I have to use this chord in this place, in this rhythm, in these sections, otherwise the piece doesn't work. Once you have those, there's a whole rest of the piece to go on top of and between that you can use all these other devices. And you can have associations of what you want these devices to mean, as I went over a little bit earlier. But you're not really tied down to using them as structurally as, say, an explicit device. So, yeah, even though Teton Pass is the only movement that has received a premiere to date, I would be remiss if I didn't go over some of the other movements of this. The second movement is the slow movement. It's entitled Chapel of the Transfiguration. This is a small Episcopal chapel that is in the unincorporated community of Moose, just inside the park's borders. And these are the Tetons behind. So the question is, how do you create a narrative that works whenever the entire thing is in the confines of this really small room? Well, there's a question of orchestration. How do you make something that's intimate and broad at the same time? How do you convey the religiosity of this? How do you convey the experience of sort of being in this very small little church? I have solo lines that come out of this big string texture that rise up and up, sort of as if they're leaping upwards to heaven. And then the secondary Teton theme, the one that really comes back full in this movement, is heard transformed into a hymn. So yeah, this is the view behind. It's a very nice place. It's a very, very peaceful place. And the piece ends with, this movement ends with variations on a plagal cadence, which is the stereotypical amen chord heard at the ends of hymns in many denominations. Which is another explicit element. It's something that you can latch on to, that you know, okay, this is what this means. And it really hammers home the point of this is reverential in some sense. The third movement is a scherzo. It's about not moose in general, but specifically my dad's desire for me to see a moose. I'd never seen a moose at that point. And I've always thought moose were kind of stupid looking. No offense, but literally, I learned this on the Alaska trip, they have to literally unhinge or pop all their joints out of socket whenever they want to move around someplace. So like, it's pretty awkward, you know, but they don't care what others think, and they're just walking around, eating grass, you know. I aspire to moose levels of not caring what other people think about me, and I think everyone else should too. The world would be a better place. So what I do here is I create a new element, which is this stupid sounding staccato that emulates the sort of wandering around of the moose, and the contrabassoon, the tuba, and the contrabass clarinet, which are three of the lowest wind brass instruments you can get. And the first Teton theme is actually transformed into just a stupid sounding backdrop for this. It's not quite as narrative based as some of the other ones, but I still sort of thought of a moose walking around and scaring little kids by looking at them. Yeah. And so the final movement is the one I first started in on, and it's one that I really am not happy with, primarily because when I started this movement, I had all the ideas in mind, but I didn't have a formalized idea of exactly how they'd be put into the piece. I didn't have the idea of explicit and implicit narrative devices. I was just sort of trying to write, you know, what I thought I felt when I saw this, not necessarily, you know, anything about telling a story. And trying to paint a picture of, you know, a particularly beautiful part of the Snake River is a very different thing from trying to create a story of seeing something or going over a pass. So this was, you know, a failure in many ways, but the failure of this led to the success of the rest of the movements in the piece, because I realized that you need to have some way of structuring these large canvases. And so if I ever return to working on this pesky oxbow bend movement, I know that I want to emulate the close of day and a place where beauty really doesn't even stop when night falls. And, you know, in order to do so, I have some ideas, but I have many other projects before having the chance to come back to this, because these other three movements that I've talked about are really just sort of in pencil drafts, and in many cases I know what I want to do with them more than I've actually sat down and figured out where things would go. But it's been a very rewarding process, and I've learned a lot about what narrative structures can mean and how to tell a story through music. And that music, you're telling a story, and the story doesn't necessarily have to be good. But if you're a composer, you're a good storyteller. And you have to have conviction in what you say and how you say it. And you have to really get the point across using, for me, it's using these different processes. Otherwise, I'm just sort of flailing blind. So that's it. Stay tuned, because my next symphony is going to be about Alaska. Yes, that's me at the Arctic Circle, and yes, we did run out of gas later on. Thank you very much.